Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our panel. Thank you so much for being here. It's wonderful to see so many people here tonight. Normally, we start these events by acknowledging the land on which the University of Toronto operates as the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. But I'm also mindful that acknowledging specific Indigenous communities that have claims to certain territories is itself a colonial practice, since such statements generally acknowledge ownership of land, which does not reflect Indigenous ways of understanding the relationships with ancestral territories. So instead, I'd like to acknowledge the various Indigenous communities that have lived here before us and keep living here now, and to say how grateful and how privileged I am to have the opportunity to live and work on their land. My name is Muscati, and I'm the director of the International Human Rights Program at the Faculty of Law. And I've been here for 2 years, and it's been such a privilege to work with some of the law school's most thoughtful students, faculty and staff, inspiring alumni, and a host of partner organizations in Canada and abroad. Our fundamental priority at the IHRP is impact. We choose all events and projects with careful consideration of the potential positive impact on our students' legal education, as well as on advancing human rights issues. Tonight, we're aiming to do just that. The IHRP, along with our partner Human Rights Watch, one of the world's leading research and advocacy organizations, have come together this evening to present a timely discussion on the darker side of the technology revolution, which has permeated so many aspects of our lives. On a personal note, it's perhaps with some irony that I'm introducing this event, given my ineptitude with technology, including the one time I was tricked into clicking on some malware, resulting in my former employer being hacked by the Syrian Electronic Army. It's a true story. Apparently, for those tech lovers in the group, it's called spear phishing. Who knew? I want to thank Human Rights Watch for not firing me after that unfortunate episode, but also for their collaboration and partnership. Our esteemed panelist, Lisa Austin from U of T, Faculty of Law, Lex Gill, who is a fellow at the Citizens Lab, and Felix, who's a researcher at Human Rights Watch, who we'll hear more about in a moment. And our team of volunteers, Allison, Danielle, Kara, Gabriella, Lauren, Petra. This would not be possible without you all. Finally, as this panel is about the digital, we want to be as online as possible. So a little housekeeping. The event is currently being streamed, perhaps somewhat ironically, on Facebook. And we are live tweeting using hashtag #DarksideTO. For the question and answer period, I encourage you to tweet your questions using the hashtag @HumanRightsWatchCanada or comment on the Facebook live stream. Now I'd like to welcome our moderator for the evening, Stephen Northfield. Stephen is the digital director for Human Rights Watch and is responsible for the digital operations for the organization. With his journalism background at the Globe and Mail and his current role, Stephen is uniquely placed to guide us through the human rights implications of digital technology. Please give me a hand in welcoming Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you, Samer. Thanks for the kind words. I'm very excited to be here. It's honored to be on a panel with such esteemed experts in this field. So I think we're going to spend a lot of time delving, as we've said, into the sort of darker side of technologies. So I thought that I would just pause before we jump into the deep, dark end of that subject matter and take a look just very quickly at some of the ways in which technology can actually be a boon for the defense of human rights around the world, and some of the ways in which that my organization, Human Rights Watch, is using it. So the core of our methodology is a researcher like Felix going into the field, gathering evidence, physical evidence, witness testimonies are at the core of it, hearing those stories from victims, from witnesses of crimes, corroborating, confirming, and then publicizing those in order to effect change. And that's always going to be the core of what we do at Human Rights Watch. But I think increasingly what we're seeing is that technology can be a real help to us in being able to investigate these crimes and effect change. And so in the very short amount of time that I have, I want to just touch very briefly on some of those technologies and what we're doing with them. I think one of the most higher profile ones right now for us is satellite imagery, is the use of satellite imagery to investigate human rights abuses. And probably the best recent example of that is the crisis in Burma with the Rohingya, we were able to use satellite technology. We have a full-time satellite tech analyst, and we were able to document the destruction through the ethnic cleansing by the Burmese army of Rohingya villages in the Rakhine state. And this technology is very effective in a couple of ways. One is it's quite irrefutable. When you show a satellite image of a village from last year that is fine, and then nothing, a picture from 2 weeks ago that shows nothing but burn scar marks from one end to the other, it's a very compelling and irrefutable sort of evidence, and we found this to be very powerful with policymakers and changing people's minds. But it's also turned out to be an amazing storytelling tool, because part of our job is to reach the world and a general audience with what we are. And again, to see the evidence so stark makes a lot of these crimes very concrete. So satellite imagery has been a very powerful tool for us. One of the other things that we're doing right now that is really nascent, but I think is also very interesting, is the use of drones. So Human Rights Watch has a little mini drone fleet now. We have 3 drones that were donated to us by somebody who wanted us to pursue this tool in our work. And the first application, that was a very interesting project that we did this year in Lebanon, where we used the drones to document about 800 trash sites across Lebanon where they were burning garbage and having a really profound health impact on local residents. And being able to use this tool and to show those things from the sky has been a very sort of powerful way for us to sort of push some of our advocacy. But we've used, we can see all sorts of applications for this. Obviously, we can do everything from sort of, monitor police conduct at protests. We can get into secret detention camps and to be able to monitor those. The size and movements of displaced people and refugees and the crises that we've seen around the world. You can imagine using drones in some ways to help us gather evidence in all of those. But I think what it's really going to help us do is get into places that we actually can't get access to, or that we can't get safe access to. So it's an exciting area for us. One of the other things that we do a lot of work in is social media. So being able to sort of use the pool of data, as we know, thousands of social media posts, pictures, testimonies, a lot of video every day. Conflicts like the Syrian conflict, there are thousands of posts every day. And we have been able to successfully harvest that. Obviously, it's fraught with problems in terms of being able to verify some of that information, but we developed a certain forensic capacity in being able to trawl through the social media. And we've used it in investigations of protesters killings in Egypt, unlawful airstrikes in Syria. We used it to document some of the facts around the killing of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, ISIS mass killings and others, and it's turned out to be, again, another very effective tool. And the final area I wanted to mention was big data. I know it's a real buzzword, but it's become sort of increasingly one that we have found very useful, to take large data sets from various sources and analyze them for trends, or to use them to be able to establish certain facts that we want to. And some of the most recent work we've done in that was we did an interesting analysis of Chinese government job listings to document the sort of gender bias that was inherent in those. We've used it, we recently scraped a bunch of data from Medicare and Medicaid to establish the prevalence of the use of antipsychotic drugs in U.S. nursing homes. In fact, we had a report that we put out this week on that, and we established a lot of that research using big data analysis. And we've also been looking at a lot of the U.S. immigration data in the light of a lot of what's happened under the Trump administration that shows some of the abusive policies directed towards immigrants in that country. So with that, I'll leave it. I'm sure we'll get back to some of these, and I will turn things over to my colleague, Felix.
Thanks, Stephen. So my name is Felix Horne. I am the Ethiopia and Eritrea researcher for Human Rights Watch. So my sort of adventures with surveillance, I guess, began in 2012. Ethiopia is a surveillance state. It has pervasive surveillance, or at least that's the perception. And we decided we wanted to spend a considerable amount of research time, considerable amount of research time trying to assess what is the actual surveillance capabilities of the world, of Ethiopia. I mean, if you talk to any Ethiopian, they have this sense that all telephone calls, all emails, all Facebook posts are monitored by the government. So we wanted to get sort of beyond that perception and see what the reality was. The other thing was that surveillance is a very sort of abstract concept. We all might have the sense that, that we are being watched by government or others. But there was a sense that, at least in Ethiopia, the surveillance was not abstract, that a number of individuals were being arrested based on what they were saying in these communications, or who they were saying them to. So we wanted to kind of delve into that. Now the report, which ultimately came out in 2014, is called They Know Everything We Do. And we'll talk a little bit about the specifics later. But it was intended to look at as I said, the sort of telecom surveillance, but also look at how they controlled the flow of information. So things like jamming of radio stations, including Voice of America, Deutsche Welle, various diaspora stations, the jamming of television stations, often from the diaspora and containing messages that were independent of the government, and blocking of numerous independent websites. And also, because there's only one telecom provider in Ethiopia, and that's the government, they frequently just turn off mobile communications, the internet, completely when it suits them. So, for example, for large periods of this past December, when there was a bit of tension in the country, they just cut off mobile communications completely outside of the capital, Addis Ababa. But one of the, so what we do with our research is we would talk to victims, in this case of surveillance. We'd also talk to witnesses, and we'd hopefully talk to perpetrators. And it was surprising to us how many former Ethiopian security forces intelligence officials came out to talk about their surveillance practices. It was not difficult to get information from them. But we were looking for information on these high-tech tools that they're using, all of this. But most of them would say to us, like, look, we have these tools. We can use them, but we don't need to use them. We know everything that's happening in every single community. We know what people are thinking before they're thinking it. We heard this repeatedly from different officials. So Ethiopia is a country where this grassroots system of surveillance sort of dovetails with these more sort of high-tech approaches to surveillance. So Ethiopia has a system called 1 to 5, where one person is responsible for monitoring the activities of 5 other people. And any sort of anti-government deviant behavior, it reports up the way. There's just sort of a pyramid. So large parts of the country are covered by this. So you don't know if the person that you're going out for coffee with is one of the 5 or the 1, or is another one within the 5. So there's this perception that everybody is watching everybody. In doing this research, I don't have the sort of tech background or the surveillance background, but doing this research was fascinating. My sort of perception of surveillance. I assumed that I'm the person, I'm the researcher, I'm researching this in Ethiopia, but I started to realize that I'm also being surveilled. Everybody's being surveilled. The diaspora are being surveilled. There's various bits of spyware that we'll talk about later that are being used by the Ethiopian government to surveil people here in Toronto. And elsewhere in outside of Ethiopia. There was one former official with Ethio Telecom, which is the telecom company, outside of Ethiopia, was telling me how easy it was to monitor everybody's phone calls. And I had given him my business card. He looked up the phone number. He had his laptop there. He logged on to the customer database from, again, outside of Ethiopia. He was no longer an employee of Ethio Telecom. He had fled, but he still had access. And he put in my phone number, and he showed me all the phone calls and text messages I had made over the previous 3 years, which isn't many because I'm very careful with how I communicate, but it was still very easy for him to access, including the locations of the people that I was speaking to and their names and their ethnicity. So yeah, really, really frightening stuff. Maybe I'll leave it there for now, and we'll talk more about the specifics of our findings later. Thank you.
Can people hear me all right? Yeah, okay. Thank you. Okay, well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to be here and to the organizers. And thanks to all of you for being here. I'm really grateful and excited to share this time with all of you. Maybe I'll start by talking a little bit about the Citizen Lab, which, if you're not familiar, is an interdisciplinary research laboratory based here at the Monk School at the University of Toronto. We do technical research and development and high-level strategic and policy engagement around a range of issues relating to technology and global security and human rights. So what that means in practice is work around targeted threats against civil society, filtering internet censorship, privacy and security of mobile applications, transparency of governments, both at home and abroad. So my background is a little bit weird and eclectic. I have a law degree from McGill, But my first love is kind of economics. I was, until recently, at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, and I just noticed Brenda right there, which is very cool. You're all in very good company. I was working on national security there. I've been at the Canadian Internet Policy and Public Interest Clinic and the Berkman Klein Center as well. So kind of weird mix of technology and human rights work that, when asked, I basically just describe as science fiction law. And that's more or less what I've been up to. It's difficult to whittle down my work into a specific project, but I thought I'd talk about 3 things I've been really proud to work on lately. The first is a lot of work around encryption and anonymity tools, which hopefully will culminate in some public reporting quite soon from the lab. So these are technologies that are really fundamental to the protection of human rights and global security. But they're also very frequent targets for government criminalization and censorship. So my work is everything around, when can a cop force you to hand over your password, to whether the government can tell a software company how to write their code. I also recently was part of a team of people who were involved in producing a submission to the Special Rapporteur on violence against women, who recently did a call on online violence against women, which is a sort of contested term. We were really lucky to have the support of the International Human Rights Program here at U of T, and Chelsea, who is our student this semester on that project. And our Citizen Lab's interest in engaging in that conversation is really because narratives about women being vulnerable and victims are often used to justify new kinds of surveillance and censorship powers. And so we really wanted to introduce a kind of counter-narrative based on this, radical idea that women might have other rights beyond being safe, like privacy or freedom of expression. And so, that project is now sort of emerging into a legal analysis around stalkerware, which we can talk about a little bit later. I've also done a bunch of work on signals intelligence recently. If folks are familiar, there's a new national security bill called C59. People might be familiar with the debate around Bill C51, the very controversial anti-terrorism law from 2015. C59 is sort of the current government's answer to some of those issues. In reality, it improves some things, makes a lot of things more complicated, and makes some things quite a bit worse. So we can talk about that after, but we've particularly focused around the role of signals intelligence agencies, and in particular, the Communication Security Establishment, which is sort of like the Canadian equivalent of the NSA. But instead of talking about any of those specific things in more detail, I guess I just wanted to share a couple of small reflections to help set the table for this talk on this idea of the darker side of digital. So the first thing is, I'm not quite sure that there are 2 sides, a light side and a dark side. Instead, there's maybe multiplicities or complexities. And technology, law, and policy is always very difficult because the boundary lines change and shift, between what is offline and what is online is not always clear. The law students in the room will understand that there's tremendous issues around jurisdiction, of the issues around competing rights get very muddy. And also to just say that, technological change is rarely good or bad, right? But it does have certain tendencies. One is that it deterritorializes and it disembodies. It has a sort of exponential effect. It increases complexity and scale and velocity of problems. There's a cryptographer, Phil Rogaway, who says cryptography rearranges power. I think that's actually true of all technology, that technology rearranges power. And that's a useful lens for thinking about the work that we do. And I guess the last thing I would want to say is, I recently heard this really powerful interview with Rebecca Solnit, who's written a lot on this idea of darkness. And she talks about wanting to rescue the idea of darkness from the pejorative for all kinds of reasons. And she wants to characterize it not as something necessarily nefarious or malevolent or evil, but darkness is a kind of unknown, as a sense of possibility or uncertainty or unknowability. And I think that's maybe more of a fertile environment to work in for this conversation. It's where I try and situate my work. just to see the future and probably parts of the present as having this dark side that's, you know, a little easier to see seeds of hope and possibility and change in. So yeah, I think that's all I want to share for now. Thanks.
Thank you. I wanted to also say thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I'm Lisa Austin, one of the law professors here at the University of Toronto. And I work a lot on privacy issues, and I was thinking about a variety of projects I've done over the years and tried to think about some of the themes that obsess me, because I tend to sort of get drawn to projects because, you know, it's like, oh, this is another example of this theme that obsesses me. And one of the themes that obsesses me in thinking about privacy and technology generally is what happens, what gets lost in translation when we shift from what I like to sometimes call the analog world to the digital world. So, you know, if we're out walking in the street in the analog world, you understand what it is to go and walk down the street, and you understand that the person who passes you on the street can see you, and you have a social understanding of what that might mean, and you have, you know, you can anticipate that, you know, it's probably unlikely that some weird person is hiding behind a tree, but maybe they are, but, you know, the person behind a window over there might peer out at you casually, and you have a sense, you can anticipate your likely audience, and you can understand what it is to walk in public. But what happens when you actually now shift to a digital world, or a world where you have sort of pervasive cameras everywhere, and you don't really understand anymore what it is to walk in that public space? You don't know who's watching you. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know who the audience is. You don't know if they're going to keep that information. You don't know if someone's even got the camera turned on. And what does it do to our understanding of what it is to be in public when you add these technologies? And now, you know, think about what it's going to mean when we have, you know, smart cities like the Sidewalk Toronto, you know, development in Toronto, and you have widespread sensors everywhere in our city space. What does public space turn into? So when we think about privacy, and a lot of our models about privacy are built in an analog world, and it's very easy in those legal doctrines and those cases and those theories to say, oh, well, you're in public, you don't have a privacy interest. And it made a certain amount of sense in the analog world. But in the digital world, it doesn't make a lot of sense. That's just an argument to actually permit fairly broad and widespread surveillance. And so a lot of what I try to do is to try to look at what's lost in translation from the analog to the digital. And I think the metadata debates that have been going on is another one that this happens to. So metadata about communications is data information about our communication. So, you know, what I say to Lex would be the content of it, but that I had a conversation with Lex would be the metadata, the information about that conversation. And again, in the traditional kind of analog world, we think, well, it's the content that is so important. That's where our privacy interest is, and there's a lesser interest in that other information. It's simply just not as revealing. But in the digital world, when you start collecting that information in the digital world, it's often structured in a way that allows you to collect it, stockpile it, and analyze it in ways that are highly revealing and unanticipated. And so the idea that it's not as private as content just doesn't work anymore. And it's not that how we thought about it in the analog world is wrong, it's we're not in the analog world anymore, and we need to think about these things differently. And so that's a lot of what I try to sort of mull over, but I think it's a much broader conversation than privacy. It's a broader conversation we have to have about technology more generally, and it's something I try to think about these days in relation to just how we regulate and our models of regulation, because as lawyers, you know, we have a lot of ways of regulating that are really, again, built on understandings of human decision-making, the frailties involved in human decision-making, how we keep human decision-making accountable and transparent. It's built around how we use words, how we interpret texts. But how we regulate the digital world isn't going to necessarily involve those things or those skills. And that's where I'm maybe a switch from the dark side of technology to maybe Stephen's story of maybe we need to enlist technology in creating new modes of accountability in this sort of digital space. And that's some of the work that I'm sort of moving towards doing as well. And I'll sort of leave it at that general level, but I know we're going to dive into some specifics in the questions.
Thanks, Lisa. This is a very big topic area, very broad, very complex. But before we sort of dive into some of the detailed work, I just kind of wanted to maybe frame this with a more of a reflection on kind of where we're at in terms of how we relate to the idea of privacy. I think from my own personal experience, I find that the people I know fall sort of into two camps. You have the camps that is completely blasé about what corporations and what governments know about them. They've sort of, and it tends, I think, to be younger, like my 3 teenage children who have sort of lived in this world all their lives. They're not worried about it. They just sort of accept it. They see there's no way of sort of, pushing back at the idea of the invasion of privacy. So there's that side of the people that I know. And then there's the other sort of completely paranoid side who feel like we're on a slippery slope towards some sort of Orwellian dystopia. And it's the end of the world. It's like a bad episode of Black Mirror. So how worried should we be is what I'm asking. Like, should we be at DEFCON 1? Are we at DEFCON 5? Like, how concerned should we be where we're at this moment in terms of our own personal kind of invasion of privacy from these different sources? Just a very general sense. Either Lisa or Lex or
I can take
Felix?
a stab at that. So first, I think I want to resist this idea that people don't care. I think that there's a difference between being jaded and disenfranchised and worn down from feeling like you have to participate in this kind of transaction to participate in public life, and thinking that that's actually a fair deal. And also to put out that there is a kind of reasonable evidence-based kind of paranoia you can have that, maybe we can turn back to. Certainly it's something that you experienced in your own work, right? But on this idea of an Orwellian world, there's that saying, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. I think that's, like dystopia is already here, it's just not evenly distributed, right? And I mean that both abroad, right? If you look at what governments like Ethiopia, what the Chinese government, the way they operate, and in countless countries worldwide, we already see the trappings of Orwellian surveillance states. Like that infrastructure is already there, but I think it also exists to some degree at home in North America. And so, how much should you worry? Well, the answer to that question is, it depends on who you are, because certainly in Canada, as in the United States, people of color, Indigenous people, poor people, people interfacing with the criminal justice system, right? These are people who are subject not only to disproportionate surveillance, but also disproportionate consequences for that surveillance. And I think that it's really important to think about privacy, not just about, as a sort of isolated right, but contextualized in this conversation about freedom and expression. So anyway, I think I just want to put that on the table to start with, that there is a healthy spectrum of paranoia through an equality lens that we should talk about. I don't know if you have other reflections on that.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's an excellent comment. I would just add that sometimes when people say people don't care about privacy, they have this kind of almost quantitative notion of privacy, that if I share information with other people, then somehow I don't care about my privacy in relation to that information. But privacy is highly contextual. It depends, right? So you might want to share information with someone for a particular purpose, but you don't want it shared with somebody else. That you shared in one context doesn't at all mean that you don't have any privacy interest in relation to a different group of people, in relation to a different kind of audience. I don't care if, with my Presto card collects information about me. If it's going to improve the efficiency of Toronto Transit, I would applaud that. I care a lot if they're handing it over to the police without a warrant, as Presto has been reported in the media of doing. And I think a lot of people would care about that as well. So I think this sort of sense of, look what people are posting on privacy, they don't care about, people are posting on Facebook, they don't care about privacy, is a very kind of simplistic way of thinking about actually the complexities of privacy. And the other point I would say is that, a lot of people just feel they have no meaningful choice. So the idea that, okay, yeah, I've done this, or I've consented, I clicked I agree in order to participate in a particular thing, it doesn't necessarily mean that you had a real meaningful choice to do so in a way that was more privacy protective. Informed consent and meaningful choice are just not the same kind of thing.
This is, I think, a good segue back to some of the work that Felix was flagging that he's been doing and tried to get to look at a community that has been sort of profoundly affected by quite, relative to our experience, obviously a pretty extreme example of what can happen. So, Felix, it'd be helpful if you could go back and sort of talk about sort of where the Ethiopia work came from, why Ethiopia, and a little bit of how you did the research. And I was particularly interested in going back to how you were talking about how that affects, because I think this is what we're here to talk about. How does this affect the individuals and what that did both within sort of Ethiopia and outside as well? So if you could sort of walk us through a little bit of that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, as I said, there's been this sort of perception of pervasive surveillance in Ethiopia, but there's very little hard evidence to actually, indicate that was happening. I would interview Ethiopians about it. So why do you think, every phone call is monitored? Like, it was obvious. Every phone call is monitored. It was just like this sort of like paranoia almost. And so trying to sort of understand where that came from, as you dig a little bit deeper, you understand that, well, everybody knows somebody that's, had been talking to their uncle in America on the phone, and somebody comes on the line and says, stop talking about that. Why are you talking about the government in a bad way? Or, their neighbor was talking to a cousin in Kenya across the border, and very shortly thereafter they were arrested based on that telephone call. So everybody has these sort of experiences that they're not terribly willing to share, because again they think that somebody is watching or somebody's listening. But everybody has this type of experience. And so as we began to sort of dig deeper into this, we talked to dozens and dozens of individuals who had been arrested, either for talking to an individual that the government didn't like, usually who was outside of the country, or because of the content of the phone calls. Now, Ethiopians don't often speak openly on the phone, so everything's using code words and analogies. And I had a call with an Ethiopian the other day where we talked about football for 30 minutes, soccer for 30 minutes. I didn't know if we were talking about soccer or if we were talking about human rights abuses by the end. It was completely useless. But so the government will interpret these sort of phone calls how it wants to. We talked to a lot of people who, there's one person in particular who really sort of stuck in my mind, who was a young journalist, and in 2012, he wanted to attend a protest. Well, at that time in Ethiopia, protests were quite rare. So as soon as he got there and pulled out a camera, he was arrested by intelligence. His camera was smashed, his phone was destroyed. Then he was taken to the local police station, where he was hung up by his wrists, he was stripped naked, and he was whipped, while they questioned him about all the phone calls he had been making over the previous 3 weeks to activists, to a Muslim rights activist outside of the country who's Ethiopian, to several international human rights organizations. We were not one of them, but several international human rights organizations. And why are you talking to these people? These people are against the government. So he spent 3 months in that police station. After he was brought down from his whipping, he was put in solitary confinement. And I thought about him this week as we were talking about this talk. That'd be good to get in touch with him. But when I interviewed him, which was in Kenya, about a year after he had this awful experience, he made the decision that he doesn't want a phone. He's shutting off from that world. So I had no way, obviously here in Canada, I had no way of getting a hold of him in short notice. His experience as a journalist, a well-connected journalist, with telecom surveillance, was that he would no longer participate in that world. Kenya's a world that's very interconnected too, and you do everything by telephone. You move money, you do everything. So that obviously had a massive impact, not only on his life at the time, but how he viewed his sort of place in the digital world into the future. Now, there's lots of legal processes in Ethiopia. The government's always fond of pointing this out. You need court warrants to facilitate surveillance, but in practice, that just doesn't happen. The intelligence officials just walk in the front door of Ethio Telecom and access all the information that they want to. I think the other thing is I hear discussions about privacy. So I live in Ottawa, so I'm Canadian. As I hear discussions about privacy and surveillance here in Canada or in the United States, there are basic protections that we have. We can debate around the edges whether those are enough or not, but there are some protections. But one of the challenges in Ethiopia is that there are virtually no protections around freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of assembly. So who you talk to, there are so many cases of Ethiopians that were charged with terrorism because they talked to somebody on the phone that the government didn't like, who were members of a legally registered opposition party or a journalist, either local or international. We're not engaged in anything that would remotely be considered something that would get you charged with terrorism. And then they get convicted. And they spend long periods of time in prison because there's very little independence of the judiciary. So those sort of protections that are in place in many countries are not in place in Ethiopia, which makes this sort of surveillance practices extremely worrying. I was very surprised at how widespread it was.
And what is it at sort of at a societal level, like the relationships between people? Like it's like you describe it, it sort of tears at the sort of social fabric of community and that sense of paranoia about everything and not being able to trust anybody.
It does. It's incredible. And so like when I do interviews, if I'm often have a translator, depending on what the language is that I'm doing the interviews in, if the person doesn't know the translator, there's just, they're not willing to say anything. If there's somebody outside of the place they're doing the interviews who's standing on the street corner in Ethiopia and they haven't seen before. There's paranoia at every single level. It really affects their abilities to talk about issues, to do business, to go to the market, to sell produce. I mean, it impacts sort of every facet of life. I think some of those things are breaking down in the last couple of years. I mean, social media is becoming more of a thing in Ethiopia. It's interesting that the concept of privacy and perception versus reality. There's still a perception that Facebook is a relatively private space. I mean, that's changing. Mm-hmm. There's more of a perception it's not a private space, but Ethiopians say things on Facebook they would never dream of saying in person or through any other medium. It's fascinating. It really has a very profound impact, and it's not just the activists, the journalists, those that perhaps you might expect would be paranoid, but it's also government officials. Mm-hmm. The government officials are spying on each other. Everyone's spying on each other. So it's a real sort of, it really impacts the sort of ability of people to live their daily lives.
And I mean, we can understand the notion of a government being able to sort of control sort of within its own domestic borders, but I think one of the things chilling about Ethiopia is the impact that it has sort of internationally on diaspora. And I just want to tell me a little bit about that impact, that they've been able to sort of reach past their borders.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. So, Ethiopia sort of controlled most of the spaces in the country where dissent can be expressed, so they've effectively limited, independent civil society, media, political parties, et cetera. And so and it's changed a little bit the last 2 years, but for the longest time, any threats inside the country were contained, and there was a perception of stability within the country. But there are hundreds of thousands of Ethiopians who have left for economic reasons, fleeing repression, lots of different reasons, who are incredibly engaged in the affairs back home. And they're in Canada, they're in the United States, they're in many African countries, they're in many European countries, they're all over the place. And soon the government began to realize that they are a threat. They're the ones that are starting independent radio stations, television stations. They're the ones that are active on social media, on Facebook, and they're not censored. They're very, very open. They do not fear the government. There was also some concerns of opposition parties being funded from abroad. Some legal opposition parties, some that are not legal. Some that are armed. So the government began to use spyware to target these members of the diaspora. So basically, the simple definition is, you get an email, it might have a link, it might have an attachment, you open it, your computer's or your device is infected, and then they can access sort of everything on that device, your files, your emails, your Skype conversations, they can log your keystrokes, they can turn on the webcam to see what you're doing, they can turn on the microphone on the computer to see what's being spoken. I mean, it's very powerful, and of course, it's very, very difficult to detect these products. And so they have used these products. They're commercially available. They've used these products to target members of the diaspora in dozens and dozens of countries, including here in Toronto. Citizen Lab, I mean, they're the experts on this. We've partnered with them on some things, but Citizen Lab is the ones that have really done a lot of good work on this. And some of this commercially available spyware are from companies in Italy, in Germany, in the UK, and most recently Israel. There was a report that came out in December from Citizen Lab that looked at some of the spyware that was used against Ethiopians, purchased from an Israeli company. And many of them are in Canada as well. There was one in Toronto, a computer, we don't know who this person is, but a computer that connected from York University pretty regularly, and then over Christmas of 2016, went to Eritrea and then came back. So the computer went to Eritrea, and then the computer came back to York University. We still don't know who that person is. Maybe today we'll figure out who it is. But this has a chilling effect on the diaspora as well. I think a lot of diaspora 10 years ago thought they're completely free to say what they want, to engage in politics how they want in the diaspora. And many now are really self-censoring their activities because of this perception that they may be surveilled. And when these citizen lab reports come out, which are excellent, we get a flurry of email from Ethiopians in diaspora saying, I think I'm one of them, I think I'm one of them. And 99% of the time they're not, but it has the same effect. They control their activities.
Yeah, if you're interested in reading that report by Bill Marczak, one of my colleagues and a whack of other really brilliant people, it's called Champing at the Cyber Bit, and it's on our website.
Yeah, it's an excellent report.
So I think that sort of the Ethiopian is a kind of a very specific and I think probably a very extreme example of a worldwide phenomenon, which is that, advances in technology that are available to governments around the world to be able to, increasing power to conduct surveillance directly, indirectly, but gather data as well on us and our lives. And so I just wanted to sort of, Lex and Lisa, what's sort of the implications, for the average citizens and like who are most impacted by this trend that we see towards this incredible power now that governments have? And obviously in conjunction, we'll talk a little bit about corporations later.
Okay, I'll take a stab at that. So in terms of who's most impacted, I think I sort of tried to get at this a little earlier. But maybe what's helpful to understand is that there's a sort of trickle-down effect going on with surveillance technology and censorship technology in particular, where you have spyware and surveillance and hacking tools that are generally first developed for nation states to do nation-state stuff, and then invariably end up sort of repackaged and resold for commercial and enterprise solutions on gray markets, for workplace surveillance. And we eventually even see those things sort of creep into markets like, for example, what we call stalkerware, right? Things that basically spy tools to monitor your ex or your spouse. So there's a proportionality issue there, but I think it's just important to understand that this stuff exists within a markets unto itself. And there's also a sort of pipeline that sometimes gets called function creep, from military applications to intelligence to more serious criminal investigations to sort of everyday neighborhood policing. So, that's how you end up seeing, drone technology is a good example of this, aerial surveillance, satellite surveillance, IMSI catchers, facial recognition, right? Things like these technologies are sort of deployed first on foreign battlefields and in refugee camps and in places where people are invisible, where their rights are not particularly well respected or accounted for. And those things, as they become sort of normalized and commercialized, bleed into our everyday lives. And so by the time you've got like a middle-class white dude in North America concerned about drones, like that's been somebody's life for the last 10 years. And so I think it's really important to understand that there is like an economy and a framework around that. So who is most impacted? Well, it's often the people who are most invisible, the people who count the least. That's sort of my reflection on that.
I think that's true. There's like enormously important equality issues around all of this that are important. I just wanted to add a kind of note, just because I'm obsessed with metadata, that there's a lot of new kind of methods of surveillance that catch up people who themselves are not under investigation. And so you have all these different kinds of bulk surveillance techniques that is as simple as, say, a cell tower dump, where you get information from all the particular users in a particular time associated with a particular cell tower, because you're going to then do a certain kind of analysis to figure out something about a particular individual. So these are those, when the Snowden revelations came out, people started calling these as, you collect the haystack in order to find the needle. And there's a lot of these kinds of techniques that are enormously useful, but they've changed the way in which we think about surveillance, because you catch up a lot of innocent people. By definition, innocent people, not, oh, I was targeting you and you turned out to be innocent. And we need their data in order to make some of these types of methods work. And I think that's very different than older methods of targeted surveillance. And even we have had examples in Canada. For example, CSIS had a database that the federal court called them out on as being illegal last year, where they were holding on to data, metadata, about people who had been caught up in investigations. Maybe they had been cleared, maybe they had just been caught up in investigations about other people, but they were retaining that data in order to analyze it in different ways. So these were people not currently under investigation or under suspicion. So there's a lot of ways in which the analysis of metadata is really useful. It allows for all sorts of government analytics, but we're using it in relation to people who are not under any suspicion. And that's a sea change in how we think about this, and I think calls for some thinking about how we protect people.
So, I mean, obviously there are examples of like, again, to go back to Ethiopia, where government is using that, obviously, to consolidate its power, to oppress its people, and to sort of control the countries and the citizens. But there are obviously, with some of this surveillance, with some of this gathering of data, there's a legitimate security concern behind it. Like, we all have a stake in security. There are bad actors out there that want to do bad things. There is an obligation on behalf of the government to protect its citizens. So I know it's a big question, but sort of where is that balance between our right to privacy and then and security, which is, which there is a legitimate case for in the application of some of these techniques?
Do you have feelings on that?
I definitely have feelings on it. I mean, I think that's in Ethiopia. That's what the government says. It says, "Oh, these people are against the government. These people are, they're quote unquote terrorists." In all walks of life, the government conflates peaceful expressions of dissent with terrorism. So it's a broader issue. But sort of as I said earlier, I mean, in places where none of those rights are protected, that line of what is appropriate, what is not, in terms of surveillance for security reasons, gets really sort of messed up. I mean, there are clearly cases where Ethiopia has, obviously they don't market this, but it's pretty common knowledge that they have intercepted communications that have tipped them off about potential attacks. The United States also, of course, works with Ethiopia as well to intercept a lot of signals from the entire Horn and the Arabian Peninsula as well. And that information does get back to Ethiopia. So there's lots of intel that they get that does prevent them from these sort of attacks. But yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one. It's one that we've had a very hard time pushing governments around the world to push Ethiopia to begin to sort of curb its surveillance powers, because they use the exact same lines that all of the Western governments use as well about where that line is.
Yeah. Sometimes when I answer this question this way, it sounds like I'm dodging the question, but I'm really not, because I think it's important to reframe or question this idea that there is always an appropriate trade-off between privacy or other human rights and security on the other end, right? In many situations in my work, it ends up actually being a lose-lose situation. And so it comes down to a bit of a fight about what we mean by the word security and whose security we're talking about. So certainly that's the case, for example, for like encryption technology, right? Governments for like the last 4 decades have been talking about how strong encryption interferes with their ability to investigate crimes and conduct useful intelligence operations, and have proposed all kinds of curious and sometimes extremely problematic solutions to this encryption problem, that there is information that the government can no longer get. And I think what's interesting about that calculation is it's a very narrow view of what it means to be secure, right? That security is where the government has access to all the information. And it's true. I think I would concede that encryption technology probably results in some cold cases and in some situations. But the balance sheet is off, right? Because there's no calculation about the vast benefits economically, right, in terms of prevention of crime that encryption technology doubtlessly is involved in, everything from the protection of people against blackmail or identity theft to the broader sort of economic benefits of being able to do like online banking safely, right? But there's also this failure to calculate the vast human rights benefits that we gain from these types of tools. So anyway, to just get back to this question, sometimes when we do the privacy security trade-off, it's actually like you lose it all, right? Encryption actually keeps us safe. So by undermining it, it's like you end up with less. But then there's just this other piece that where the government engages in surveillance, there's been this like long-term civil society conversation around it, and there's a set of principles. Sometimes they're called the 13 principles or the necessary and proportionate principles. And without getting too much into the weeds of that world, I think that's probably, those are the values we want to start with, right? Is it necessary? Is it proportionate? And I don't think that we exist in that climate right now, certainly not here in Canada, and probably definitely not elsewhere.
I guess all I would add to that is, when we think about this, if I just put it in a kind of a constitutional framing, just keep it in Canada, we don't have a right to privacy. We have a right to be secure from unreasonable search and seizure, and that's been understood to protect a reasonable expectation of privacy, which is understood to be balancing privacy interests against state interests, including law enforcement and national security. So even at the constitutional level, balancing of these ideas is at the heart of what we do. That's part of what the liberal democratic framework is. What I think the interesting question in Canada, not Ethiopia, it sounds like there is no balance. They're looking for something remotely like a balance, but we have a balance. I would go back to saying, we think about this balance as we've constructed it in an analog world, and then we just kind of assume that we can just migrate it over into this digital world, and we need to be really worried about actually what's happening when we migrate it over. So, for example, in Bill C59 that Lex mentioned, the Canadian our sort of spy agencies are being allowed to look at publicly available data on Canadians.
Can we put big air quotes around that, though? Like publicly available information? Sorry. Go
on. And I have a big issue with that because I think that, this idea that there's no privacy interest in information that's in the public sphere in some form is a problematic idea of privacy in this digital space. And what it does is it augments surveillance power and tilts the balance, not translates the balance. And I think that's what we have to kind of keep our eye on. What's getting lost in translation? Are we really just shifting what we already had and reproducing it? Or, is the surveillance powers growing because we're not paying attention to what's going on as we shift over?
It's an interesting, so where are we at sort of with C59? Where are we at kind of, what is the stat? Like how would you characterize the current protections, and like, are we like, I know it's both, for both of you, do we have a lot of work to do? Do we have a relative, compared, say, to other sort of Western countries, are we relatively have more progressive legislation around protecting privacy? Where would you situate Canada, and where do we sort of see that whole debate going?
Okay, we're going to do some building blocks here first. Okay, so Bill C59 is the new national security legislation. It's sort of the government's answer to Bill C51, but Bill C59 contains all kinds of things. It's 150 pages long. It's everything from like the terrorist entities list and the no-fly list to CSIS disruption powers, right? To talk about the issue of privacy in particular, I think we'll probably like hone in on the CSE CSIS stuff. And so I think that the way to characterize it is maybe like 2 steps forward, 6 steps back. I guess if you 1, 3, we can just do fractions. So in some ways, the legislation makes some positive changes, right? So there's some good, which is new oversight and accountability functions, which have been sorely needed and which academics and civil society have been asking for a long time. There's the sort of bad, which is the fact that, particularly in the case of the CSE, which is, again, our signals intelligence agency, a bit like the NSA, it really normalizes a long-standing practice of what they call unselected bulk collection, which probably you and I would just call mass surveillance, which is sort of unselected mass collection of information about people, not on the basis that they necessarily have done anything wrong or that they're using a particular search term, but just sucking up the whole internet. So Bill C59 normalizes that contact, which has not just privacy implications for Canadians and people in Canada, but also in terms of Canada's international human rights obligations. And then I guess there's also a sort of like ugly, which is that, as Lisa mentioned, C59 creates a whole new exception allowing the CSE to collect what they're calling publicly available information about Canadians and people in Canada. So this is, again, a foreign signals intelligence agency. They're not supposed to be directing their activities domestically, and yet they've created this fantastical exception that allows them to, in effect, collect everything from, your credit score to your MySpace page from 2006 to your college radio show from 2003, as well as potentially information that they get through hacks or leaks or breaches. So if you think about like Ashley Madison or the Equifax breach, like that stuff is included there. And then the other piece is that never before discussed in public life, the CSE is potentially going to get what they're calling cyber operations powers, which is like a new universe of state-sponsored hacking that is outside of any of the establishment's previous mandate in a lot of ways, which would give it, the CSE, the ability with very, very minimal oversight to hack foreign adversaries, engage in maybe what we might think about as cyber warfare, but also hack for like international affairs types reasons. Foreign intelligence gathering could allow them to modify the contents of websites, could allow them to impersonate people online. So this is a big deal. It's something that we ought to be having a big public conversation about, and it's tremendously difficult, I think. We can all agree, because we have to do this sort of like, well, first I have to tell you that there is a signals intelligence agency in Canada. Now we have to tell you why this is problematic. So, conversations like this are important. I don't know if you have other thoughts on C59. I've been doing this a lot lately. Yeah. Reflections? Yeah, you're good.
I mean, it's obviously the government will have quite a capacity then to collect a lot of raw data. What are there? So, information about me is sitting in some database somewhere. But what powers, what restrictions are there on them being able to access that and utilize that for whatever purpose that they might want? Are there restrictions on the actual use of that data that can give me some comfort in how private those communications and that data is?
Yeah. So one of the challenges with C59 in particular is that the CSC has a set of obligations to introduce privacy protective measures in the law, but there's no information whatsoever about what those measures look like. They'll be set in regulation after the bill is adopted. So it's sort of like a bit of a trust us framework, which normally, at least from my perspective, isn't really good enough. And this is also not to insinuate, right, that the CSE is up to no good necessarily, right? But you're talking about one of the most powerful institutions in the world with extraordinary surveillance capabilities, extraordinary technical abilities. You really want to get it right in terms of limiting the scope of powers to begin with, rather than giving this full range of abilities and saying like, well, we'll just trust you to use that within the bounds of law. And I think that maybe something to just add to this conversation is, trust us isn't good enough because democracies are really quite fragile and institutions are fragile. If we look to our neighbors in the South, we see databases that were meant for, like traffic regulation being used to round up undocumented people. So I think that we have to just have a long-term view of what kind of infrastructure we want to be building.
Yeah, I would add that one of the roles that the CSE plays is it has also what we call an assistance mandate. So it can assist the RCMP, for example. So it can assist in sort of domestic investigations, but then its ability to assist is going to be constrained by whatever legal authority constrains, say, the RCMP. So, and there are all sorts of constraints, right? This isn't Ethiopia.
No, yes.
There are all sorts of constraints about, for example, how the RCMP could get access to that information and use it. And this gets very, very, very complicated, but yes, we're in a world plenty of legal constraints. I guess the space that worries me within some of this is, I told you I have certain key obsessions, is how we deal with the terms of access to metadata in the, say, the criminal code and in the Canadian law generally. So we have a set of, protective constraints about that govern the terms of that access. Are they the right ones? Are sort of some of the questions I would ask, but it's not a legal constraint-free zone, for sure.
I mean, it's worrisome enough that our own government has this data. What is the sort of restrictions on them sharing it with, say, foreign governments? So what protection do I have as a Canadian that my own government is not going to give information to me, to the British, to the Americans, to others?
To the Ethiopians.
To the Ethiopians.
Yeah, it's a complicated question. It's, the interesting thing about working on signals intelligence stuff is that most of this stuff happens in secret, right? So we can speak in generalities. So of course there are a great deal of restrictions around, disclosing Canadian data, or even using, as Lisa said, using Canadian data or sharing it with foreign governments while they're allied or otherwise. But where, to the extent that you're engaging in bulk collection, right? Like, this is really the business of making the haystack as big as possible, right? Like all the hay in the world. And so the issue isn't necessarily, it is in some ways, but we're really talking about sort of collateral or incidental impacts on rights that are just as important. So when you suck up all the information and you sort of try and narrow it down to not include Canadian data or whatever, there are going to be errors in the process, and those are going to have real impacts on people's lives, particularly where disclosing to foreign governments. So, yeah, reflections on that?
So I wanted to talk a little bit about the Snowden revelations as a kind of a real game changer here. I mean, it was a sort of dramatic revealing of this massive amount of aggregating of data, both with the United States and with its allies, that we were largely not aware of before. And so talk to us a little bit about what the impact of Snowden was then, how it changed the debate, and how it still kind of informs the debate in 2018 around these issues of privacy.
Sure, I'm happy to start with that one. Speaking for myself in kind of in this academic bubble of thinking about privacy, the Snowden revelations just kind of blew up this world very dramatically when they came out. And I think what it did is it allowed some of us to say things like metadata in public, and some people in the audience would start nodding, right, without a long explanation, because before that it was just kind of a really boring type of topic that you couldn't get very many people interested in. Who cares if people get access to basic subscriber information or some of these issues that have been floating around in the courts? And so understanding that if you say certain forms of metadata aren't private means the state doesn't have to get permission necessarily to get access to it, means you can go and collect it in bulk, means you can do all of these things with it, right? I think was just really sobering when you saw it on the scale that came out in the Snowden revelations, and really started shifting many people's understandings of the issue and the seriousness of it.
I think just maybe one thing, two little things that I would add is I think the Snowden documents really created a bit of a crisis of trust and a crisis of legitimacy in Western governments that had typically been given a great deal of benefit of the doubt in the way they operated. So I think that's changed. The way people talk about these institutions has changed. And I think they also politicized the technical community in a way that had existed to some degree, but really was a little bit more on the fringes. So, there are some great successes that came out of this, the adoption of HTTPS. I think you can sort of track that story to the Snowden stories. The fact that There are now new technologies like Secure Drop that facilitate whistleblowing, anonymous whistleblowing, or the fact that tools like Signal are now way more, and Tor are way more usable, in part because of an influx of cash and resources and expertise into organizations doing this work, because technologists kind of woke up and realized somebody had to be building a counterbalancing collection of technologies. So, yeah.
So we've been talking, I think, a lot about sort of governments, and obviously, the other side of the coin around a lot of these issues is the corporations who are, creating this technology, social media platforms that are profoundly changing our sort of sense of self and privacy. So talk to me a little bit about sort of, what the roles of corporations are, and the kind of impact they have as actors on some of these issues around privacy. Clearly, we have a case, as you documented in Ethiopia, where there's a very direct relationship between companies developing these technologies and the application of that to oppress people. But sort of more in a more broad, sort of global sense, what are the roles of sort of evolving roles of corporations in some of these issues that around privacy?
I can start. So it's interesting to me when you think about all of the data that's available about all of us. If the government was trying to collect it directly, we'd all have a fit. But we let the state collect it from private companies, and we need to pay attention to the terms under which the private companies are collecting this data. And the major piece of legislation in Canada that we sort of govern this through is PIPEDA, our federal privacy legislation that applies to the private sector. And this was legislation that was passed to get Canadians to shop online. Right, it was passed in the late 90s, and it was really, you don't have to worry about it. You can buy your widget online, and your credit card information is safe. It was about, allowing people to feel okay about putting their basically shopping information online. So it was e-commerce legislation. It was very kind of consumer-friendly e-commerce legislation. And we're trying to make it do a whole bunch of things now that it was never meant to do, including regulate these platforms that have come to dominate our lives. And so built into the heart of that legislation is a balance between, privacy rights and the legitimate needs of businesses. And when the Federal Privacy Commissioner looked at Facebook, there was a Facebook complaint many years ago now, launched by CIPIC, a clinic at the University of Ottawa. And when they started looking at one of these complaints, one of them was just, should you be forced to consent? So it's forced to consent. It's not consent when you're forced, but forced to consent to Facebook ads as a condition of signing up for Facebook. And you would think under this informed consent legislation, the answer was no, you can't be forced to consent to anything. But the privacy commissioner said, well, look, this is a different era. Their whole business model is they provide this for free. So, of course, if you want this free thing, you have to submit to, the surveillance model of advertising that goes along with it. And so what it did was show us that our e-commerce legislation drafted to get Canadians to shop online was really inadequate to deal with this new era of platforms that are sort of, offering their services on the condition that you give up all your information in this way. And so what we need is a stronger kind of human rights framing of privacy in our private sector legislation, not this consumer enabling kind of, let's all shop legislation, or we're not going to protect that basic private infrastructure of how is our information being collected, because that's where it starts, and then it goes to the state.
Yeah. I guess, yes. But and also I think that it's important to sort of add that it's not just that private companies are sort of brokers or intermediaries that provide a platform for freedom of expression and the exercise of other kinds of rights, but also that there are companies that are really actively engaged in the business of Black Mirror, right? And I would include in that category for sure spyware companies, companies in the business of selling hacking tools, and internet filtering and censorship companies. And so I think it's important to say businesses have an obligation to respect and account for international human rights. And what can Canada do about that? What should government do about that? Well, I think the first piece is our government should be very mindful of the types of, it shouldn't be funding these kinds of businesses. It shouldn't be propping them up where they're operating in Canada and selling this stuff abroad, which is unfortunately the case in some instances. And it shouldn't be doing business with them here in Canada. So there is, for example, around internet filtering technology, the lab has done some research in that area. And so I think it's just important to think like that. It's not just like Facebook has this sort of regulating role in terms of speech, but also like there are businesses that are just totally selling like spyware and censorship stuff, and we shouldn't be supporting that.
I mean, I think the commercial spyware world is sort of the big thing in Ethiopia, and the interactions we had with those spyware companies was very much one of, we have these policies that the governments are to use these products lawfully. That's it. You're giving this spyware with virtually no strings attached to a repressive government. You have to have some sort of monitoring provisions or some sort of nuance to that policy. And if you look at some of the lists of the governments that these spyware companies do provide that information or that product to, it's Canada, the United States. It's a lot of Western democracies, but it's also a lot of very repressive governments. And my sense is that there's sort of, because technology changes so quickly and these products are constantly morphing and constantly changing, that the law and policy just can't really keep up with it. And so there's kind of this space where those companies can operate without any real sort of oversight, which is obviously very problematic. I mean, now in some of the, in Europe, there are export licenses required to export products like that, some of these commercial spyware to certain governments, but in practice, I don't think it's made a huge difference, in terms of not providing those products to repressive governments or putting conditions on their use that can then be monitored. So no, it's a big problem, and it's a lot of money, right? I mean, there's one Italian spyware that Ethiopia uses called Hacking Team. And there was a fairly public leak of their emails. Hacking Team was hacked, basically. And it's very interesting, sort of the discussions that they were having with the different governments, including the Ethiopian government, about the product. And Ethiopia wasn't using the product correctly, so it was causing lots of problems, including groups like Citizen Lab being able to kind of follow the digital cookie crumbs to understand how this product worked. But the cost that they were talking about was $1 million US for, if I remember correctly, it was about 20 simultaneous targets. I mean, it's a lot of money. So there's a huge financial imperative for these companies not to have sort of regulations that make it more difficult for them to operate.
We're sort of at this interesting kind of unique moment. I think I'm thinking of Facebook in particular, whether there's any thoughts about where we're at. I think they've obviously under enormous pressure with the revelations about the interference in the election and some of the other scandals that have come up in the last year. And there is this sort of sense that they're rapidly trying to fix some of the problems, the challenges they face because they're trying to stay in front of regulators. And I was just curious whether there's any thought around, like, do you think that we're heading into an era in which there's a greater receptivity to the idea of being a heavier regulatory hand, not just on large platforms, very influential platforms like Facebook, but just sort of the internet generally, that we've seen the deleterious effects of some of these platforms and the internet generally, and that now is time for the sort of pendulum to swing back a little bit and to sort of, tighten the bolts down a little bit on it. Do you see that trend for us in the future?
So I think there's a lot of calls for regulating the Facebooks of the world and maybe more generally, but the tricky, difficult parts are always around the global nature and global reach of these technologies, and how you bring the public interest into that if the public interest is bounded jurisdictionally in different sorts of ways. And so it's not an easy problem to solve as a regulatory problem.
Yeah, for the law students in the room, there was recently a case of the Supreme Court between Google and a company called Equistec, and without getting into the strange and weedy details, this is essentially a case where the Supreme Court upheld an interlocutory injunction, which is effectively permanent, to apply a global de-indexing order to Google. So essentially ordering Google to remove a bunch of search results from its search results, not just on sort of google.ca or bound within the particular territory that is called Canada, but worldwide, over a trade secret dispute, effectively, as a way of enforcing a set of private rights. And what's fascinating about this is, a lot of commentators sort of argued, well, look, there's a sort of bigger issue at play here, where even though there's maybe not a very live freedom of expression issue in this case, if we're accepting that a Canadian court can decide what people in, Bangladesh or Japan or Germany can see on the internet, we may be accepting a sort of reciprocal responsibility or reality where we can allow those countries to decide what Canadians can see on the internet. And, so that's a big, messy, emerging debate about, where there are these extraterritorial type problems, there is a risk that we end up in a sort of race to the bottom on freedom of expression, not just on resolving private wrongs. It's probably the nerdiest thing I'll say today.
Yeah, I was curious. So we've been talking about a range of different types of technology. What are the sort of technologies that are emerging? Like, what are the things that we should be thinking about in the coming 2, 3, 5 years that are not really sort of mainstream? You talked about the interesting idea of mission creep. So what's that thing that is a very specialized niche right now that's going to end up being that thing that sort of changes all of our lives in 5 years when it goes sort of mainstream? What are the things we should be thinking about?
So, since we're in Toronto, I would say artificial intelligence, right, is the big kind of new buzzword, but more than buzzword, right, because it's become such a powerful part of so many different areas of technological development. And one of the things that I would like to see the human rights community focus on is an area that sometimes gets labeled algorithmic responsibility, or sometimes called fair, accountable, transparent algorithms. So, an algorithm is just kind of a recipe for how to do something. It's a set of instructions for a computer. In the artificial intelligence space, there's different kinds of machine learning algorithms, ways in which you can train even a machine to learn different things. So when we say algorithmic responsibility, sometimes it's really just focusing on, right, when you're automating decision making or doing certain kinds of analysis that gets automated to then, assist a human decision maker in different kinds of contexts. And how do we make sure that part of the conversation right now is how do we make sure that those processes are transparent, right? And a lot of the transparency concerns come out of the privacy community. We have a lot of experience talking about transparent information practices. There are a lot of concerns about how do you make sure that those algorithms are non-discriminatory. So when algorithmic decision making has been a part of, say, sentencing decisions or predictive policing, there's a lot of concerns around whether there's discrimination sort of being baked into these models. But I think it's a broader discussion than that. This is going to be part of our life. This is how all of this data that's being collected and increasingly collected, not just through how you interact on the internet, but the Internet of Things, smart cities, et cetera. There's all this data everywhere. How it's going to be analyzed is going to be through these algorithms, and it's going to have an impact on all of you. There's all sorts of decisions that are already getting made about you in education and finance and health, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so we need a broader conversation about what it means for that to be responsible and fair than just thinking about discrimination in a kind of narrow way. And I think that the human rights community, human rights is a language of, being very suspicious of power and raising lots of good critical questions about the exercise of power and recognizing new forms of vulnerabilities. And I think that's exactly what we need in that space.
And I think with AI, one of the things that's probably not well recognized is this is already here. These algorithms are already churning away in the background, affecting our lives. And there's been interesting work done on the algorithms that are being used in the state of California to determine the parole designation, whether you should be eligible for parole. And you can just imagine all the kind of embedded assumptions and possible discriminatory aspects of a machine that is making those kinds of life and death decisions for people.
So it's racist.
It's a pretty profound subject area. Yeah. So I wanted we're going to move to questions very soon. So I wanted to kind of like cap off this part of the discussion by asking you all to sort of give us a thought about what we as citizens can do. Just try to be sort of empowering for us to, what's advice that you would give to us in terms of either knowledge that we should gain, measures that we should take, to try to mitigate some of the concerns that we're seeing, where the sort of intersection of technology and on our sense of privacy and our lives. And if you could leave us with a thought that that we could take with us from this discussion.
I mean, on Ethiopia. Yeah. Is that how I started the answer to every question? I mean, I think one of the things with Ethiopians that, and it's applicable to other countries, I'm sure too, is that there's so much fear about this pervasive surveillance. And although the government has the technical capacity to hoover up massive amounts of data, this is not Snowden stuff. It's still very basic how they use these sophisticated tools. It's clear they don't have a lot of human capacity yet to analyze that data and to use it in particular ways. So I see a lot of Ethiopians that there's, including the diaspora, who don't lead normal lives because of this fear. I mean, there's lots of tools out there to protect yourselves, or to at least minimize the likelihood of being surveilled. Again, I'm talking about Ethiopia. Things like you mentioned Tor, VPNs, encrypted messaging apps. Many Ethiopians are terrified to use those because they fear that if it's seen they're using those, or that they're accessing those websites, or to download those particular programs, that they're going to be arrested. And we have found some cases of that. In fact, there was some well-known bloggers were actually charged with terrorism, and one of the pieces of evidence that was in the charge sheet was that they attended a digital security course outside of Ethiopia to learn how to protect themselves. But this message is getting through, though, that a little bit, that there is lots of good sides to technology. You can protect yourself to minimize the risk of the negative sides, and we're seeing more and more Ethiopians, despite those fears, using technology in effective ways. And so, not to go off in a different direction, but there's been widespread protests across Ethiopia the last 2 years. The protests really have increased because of Facebook, because people getting over that fear and using Facebook as a medium to share information on what's happening in other parts of the country, but also to mobilize and organize. And quite frankly, the world, including Human Rights Watch, has understood a lot about those protests through people's courageous use of that technology.
So Citizen Lab actually just released a new tool called Security Planner, which you can find at securityplanner.org. So rather than being prescriptive about the types of tools that you might want to use to protect your privacy, it's like a really easy kind of questionnaire and like a safe set of habits that you can develop over time at your own pace. And so because these issues are contextual, right? Like we all have security people call it different threat models. We're concerned about different types of issues. So what might meet your needs or your concerns might not necessarily meet mine, and vice versa. So Security Planner is a really good resource. But I do want to just be a little bit resistant to this idea too that the answer to state surveillance should be like some kind of individual self-defense. I think it's really important to talk about privacy and security and expression as part of an ethics of care, as part of a community practice. We don't communicate alone, right? And so talking about building surveillance and censorship-resistant communities is really about building communities and talking about these types of issues in your peer group and in your workplaces, particularly for people who are maybe journalists or human rights workers, lawyers, people who have particular concerns around this. I think that there's a particular kind of ethic that has to be developed a bit more in a considered way. And then I guess, what can ordinary people do? There's this other thing around technologists, right? Technologists are ordinary people. And you can help build things like Signal and Tor. There's a whole open source community that is waiting for your energy. And if, instead you're spending your time in an office job working for a mega corporation, there's also a question maybe don't build the Death Star. There is, we have to talk more about engineering ethics. There's a really good essay on this that is totally not my line. I can't remember the author now, but we have to really think critically about who is building these tools, to what end, for what purpose, and there has to be resistance in those spaces too.
And on the community theme, I would add civic action. So, I mean, the Canadian community generally has very effectively pushed back at a lot of government overreach in terms of when they've asked for broader lawful access powers to increase their sort of surveillance reach. There's been a lot of public outcry that very effectively pushed back some of the excesses of some of those proposals. And I think, Canadians have mobilized around Bill C51 for some of the excessive ideas that were there around information sharing. So I think the Canadian public is very good at thinking about state surveillance. Where we haven't been as active in the sort of civic space is around the private sector piece of it, right? And I think that's where we should not be so complacent. I was recently looking at the Sidewalk Toronto proposal for the waterfront redevelopment. I'm fascinated by smart cities. And there's a lot that's really interesting going on there, but what really struck me was just this statement of, don't worry, we're going to follow all applicable privacy laws. And, that sounds so comforting. Of course, we're going to follow the law. But you should not be complacent. You should ask, well, is the law adequate, right? Because the law they're going to follow is the e-commerce law from last century that was about getting Canadians to shop online. It's just not going to do the trick in this kind of world that's getting built there. So we need to be there, as citizens saying, whatever that is, that's the baseline. We want best practices that are much above that, and we need to be part of that conversation collectively.
I just want to remind people that may be watching through the streaming that they can tweet questions, use the hashtag, hashtag DarksideTO, leave questions in the comment section of our Facebook page. People in the audience can fill out cue cards and send them along. So I've got a few questions. This is a spontaneous part of the discussion where we come out of nowhere. Not to give us your personal secrets, but I have a question from Amanda on Twitter, is how do the panelists manage their own individual online presence in the light of their work? So probably don't want to give us all the family secrets, but maybe just a glimpse of how paranoid you are and what measures you take to protect your own security around your work, but just from a personal sense as well.
Your answer.
All three of you. I mean, and Felix, you have a fascinating issue with you're dealing with people for whom your communication with them puts them at peril. So how do you, again, without giving away all the family secrets, how broadly, sort of generally, do you deal with those issues?
Yeah, lots of paranoia, definitely. Probably lots of self-censorship, to be honest. Self-censorship in order to protect the people that I'm speaking with. But one of the challenges is, if I'm using lots of encrypted tools and they're not, that's not terribly effective. And I remember the day I had my first PGP email, which is sort of a basic, old school encryption, is that accurate? Email exchange with someone in Ethiopia. It was 3 months ago. So there's a real fear of using those sort of very basic technologies. So I think I spend, I'm not a tech head, as you can tell, but I spend half of my time just trying to convince people I'm communicating with to use the most basic technologies. Now, one of the things that Ethiopians do a lot, and I do a lot, is just simple things like using anonymous emails. I can't remember the last time I got an email from an Ethiopian where the name was actually, the person that I was communicating with. Some just really low-tech solutions like that, but there's lots of higher-tech stuff too.
Lisa, Lex?
Sure. I keep a pretty low profile, and then I'm continuously kind of astonished at how many digital tracks I still use. So I'm not a big social media user. I use Twitter, and that's it. Occasionally I sign up for other things for research purposes, and then I delete my account. So, occasionally I pop up in some of these other spaces, but I don't use social media. My kids don't use social media. And I don't even have data on my phone, actually. I guess I collect Wi-Fi. But so I actually don't use a lot of these things very much, but you know, it's interesting. My spouse is a software engineer who creates organizing tools to connect people, and he loves to collect information about people. So, you know, our household, you know, maybe between the two of us, we kind of average out somewhere in the middle. So I'm on the more paranoid side, and he's on the more, you know, more information and sharing is better. So, and my kids end up somewhere in between.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is an interesting I mean, I don't know if I have a really good answer to this question. I get asked it all the time, right? Like, do you worry about being under surveillance? Like, you know, I think about this all day and I don't have a great answer to it. I think that there is a degree of self-censorship that takes place in my work, like if I'm being honest, right? I think a lot about you know, saying things the right way at the right time. And I think that's, you know, partly that's being a responsible public advocate. But there is like a sort of latent concern, I think, yeah, sometimes that I feel in my work. But I also, I mean, I live a lot of, you know, to be an effective advocate, you also need to be able to speak publicly and sometimes like poke the bear a little bit. And I think that you do a lot of role modeling by publicly poking the bear. So I don't want to lose that edge in my work. And so I think that's a constant, you know, reflection and dialogue for people who work in this space, but, you know, for colleagues of mine who are human rights activists, who are lawyers, who are journalists. You know, that's a reality of this world that we don't really talk about very often publicly. Yeah, but I appreciate the question.
I have a question from the audience about biometrics. Could you discuss the future biometrics specifically when they're packaged in user-friendly consumer products like Google Home, Google Face Recognition, those types of things, and what kind of effect those types of technologies could have on us?
You want to go with that? I mean, you can change your password, but like you can't change your retinas, right? So there's definitely I mean there's security issues, just, you know, plain security issues with using biometric identifiers as a method of authentication or identification that I think are worth exploring. I think, so that's an issue. There are interesting issues around whether the same level of constitutional protections apply to people where, you know, for example, your face or your fingerprint is used to unlock a mobile device, to decrypt a device, which are really sort of nerdy and potentially academic, but will invariably have real implications for people's human rights, particularly in the criminal law context. And I think that there's also, you know, something that I'm concerned about is identity management, which is a very sexy concept with some governments in the world, and is increasingly bleeding into like NGO universe in ways that I think are really problematic. Like, for example, for delivery of certain kinds of benefits or entitlements in like the World Food Program is experimenting with using retina scans to provide food in refugee camps, you know, for example. So I think that there's, you know, when we think about the privacy trade-off, I mean, that's a pretty extraordinary example, right? Opt into this program or you know, you don't eat. So, you know, I think that the biometric universe bleeds into this identity management, consolidated identity management stuff that in a way that's pretty disturbing sometimes. Some reflections there. Just spitballing.
There was a question on the issue going back to Ethiopia and but what Felix human rights groups are doing in Ethiopia. I mean, it's obviously, I mean, it's a tough environment for us to work and navigate in, but like, what about at the grassroots level? Like, is there a capacity given the oppressive state and the surveillance of the activities there for any meaningful sort of grassroots human rights activity? What does that look like on the ground in Ethiopia?
Yeah, I mean, there's not much, and that's not to take away from those that are trying really hard on the ground. But I mean, there was a law passed in 2009 that basically just decimated the civil society that works on anything to do with human rights or good governance. Basically said that any group cannot get more than 10% of its funding from foreign sources, and Ethiopia. People don't have a lot of disposable income, particularly if you're not connected to the government, who aren't terribly interested in those type of organizations to begin with. So just decimated overnight the human rights movement. I would say there's one functional NGO in the country of 100 million, and their activities are severely constrained. You will hardly ever see them like publish anything. I shouldn't say that. They publish lots, but it's not easy to find their products. They intentionally maintain a very low profile because they need to, and they're clearly been under surveillance, sort of low-tech surveillance, but also that the telecom surveillance. They're quite scared. I mean, there's lots of individuals that sort of do work under the radar, but no, it's a very, very difficult environment to operate for human rights workers, which is one of the problems. Like some of the information about surveillance, it's just there. It's the nature of surveillance. It's very hard to get information on abuses related to surveillance, but it's even more difficult when there's all these restrictions in place on journalists and civil society and others to try to understand how these these sort of abstract concepts are play themselves out in reality.
I have a question from John on Twitter. He asked, does the availability of surveillance and censorship technology have a corrupting effect on the governments that use them? So as they become addicted to these tools, does it change the way those governments act?
One thing that I guess I would just say to that is that it's very hard to take away toys once you have them. Parents understand this rule. And so I think, whether or not it changes behavior, it changes capabilities, and things become sort of normalized, right? And we see this with law enforcement. You get access to a tool for the purpose of, investigating serious organized crime or terrorism. And inevitably the question comes up, why can't we use this to catch people who are speeding? Or, the technology is there. And so I think that's an issue that's kind of live in that question.
Yeah, I guess, I want to say, it depends on the legal constraints in the environment that people are operating within. I think it's quite different. It would depend on the nature of the state, of the sort of, political and legal constraints that operate that might rein that in. So it's hard to answer in the abstract.
I have a question from Carolyn on Twitter, and I'll take her word for it. The Microsoft president said this, but I'm talking publicly about the need for a Geneva Convention to address, Geneva Convention-like convention to address the growing problem of nation-state cyber attacks, and that this is a necessary step globally to protect citizens. Is that something that sounds like a completely crazy idea, or I guess broadly speaking, is there global cooperation around the issue of trying to mitigate this type of kind of state actor-led attacks utilizing all of these technologies?
The lab does some work on this. I can talk a little bit about this. But do you want to talk about this?
No, go
I
for
feel
it.
like I'm talking so much. I feel like it's the Lex show up here. Okay, so I think what's important to understand about this world of cyber operations and state-sponsored hacking, and this is a very new universe. It's a very new public conversation where the norms and the rules of the game are not set. And I think it's very dangerous to talk about them as though they are. So I think this idea that states are just going to do this and that's part of how the world works now is something that we ought to contest, something that we ought to really think through. There are profound human rights issues at stake. So whether the solution is a Geneva Convention for the Internet or not, certainly I think that there's there's space to be talking about how does this kind of conduct interface with international human rights norms, interface with issues like state sovereignty, so we, and Bill C59 is the perfect case study for a situation in which, a lot of politicians are kind of taking for granted this idea that Canada should be in the business of, interfering with communications tools, and all of that stuff. And it's not a foregone conclusion. Right, and it shouldn't be. Yeah.
There's a question here from the audience. It's an interesting one. So technology is evolving. Governments obviously have a huge need to be able to stay in front of technological developments, obviously for policy reasons and for other reasons. But so much of the energy, the intellectual energy around technology, obviously flows to the private sector. So how are governments, our governments, first, I guess, generally, are they well equipped generally to stay in touch with technology? Do they tend to be to be behind from a policy and a knowledge standpoint, or what can they do to try to kind of stay current and be a critical player in sort of, regulating some of these technologies and the impacts of them?
That's going to be you.
I think governments are generally behind.
Right.
I think most of us commentating on this are generally behind, right? So there's this sort of different waves in which, and it makes regulating very, very difficult because you have to have sort of technologically neutral laws, and yet they're passed in a particular sort of context. And so there's always that question about, do you keep kind of pushing the boundaries of a particular legal framework to make it work for now what's coming down the pipe, or are you in that moment of law reform? And that's a tricky one. I think we're at that space right now with private sector privacy legislation in Canada. I think that e-commerce framework doesn't work. I think we need a human rights framework for the private sector, would be my view of that, and that we're just kind of stretching this model to the breaking point. But I think, you have to do your best to have a model that looks neutral at the time it's never neutral. And just keep kind of trying to push it until it's like, well, no, now we're at the break point. Now the world has been transformed and we need to sort of go back to it.
On Ethiopia, it's fascinating. Like I mentioned, Facebook is a space where people, speak much more openly. And I think generally when a technology comes to that country, people use it very openly. There's not necessarily a perception that a new technology is surveilled. And the government, although it has some pretty advanced surveillance technologies, is a bit slow to acquire new ones. So Facebook very much was a space where people would talk openly, and there didn't seem to be many reprisals for that activity. And then slowly, the government began to catch on. Wow, Facebook is how these protests are happening, how young people are communicating. And so the response to that was the police officers would just grab people's phones and physically look at what they were posting on Facebook. Very, very low tech. So the sort of stuff we talked about with Ethiopia is pretty depressing. But there are these sort of opportunities where people on the ground are using technologies faster than the government can keep up with them. So I think that provides some opportunities.
That's an interesting question. So how do you, all three of you, it's impossible to wrap your arms around everything that's happening. Just on a personal level, what do you do to try to say, I think we all struggle with this, right? It's that, I have a kind of a fairly small and contained world around sort of, largely digital media. Even that I find very difficult to sort of keep up on what's happening in publishing and social media platforms that are relevant to the kind of work I do, Human Rights Watch. Which is, at a personal level, what do you do to sort of keep up on things? How do you get from falling behind and not being sort of relevant to what the debates are? Read.
Read. Hang out with hackers.
Do you find the mainstream media useful, or is it all specialty publications?
Oh, I'm getting eyes from a journalist from the CBC in the back. I think there are journalists who are doing a really good job at this in Canada. So I think there are journalists who are working really hard to cover these issues. Whether or not they seep into this sort of like mainstream public consciousness or not, and at what speed and with what sort of ideological bent is a different conversation. But I think, the Canadian media does a better job of this, I think, than elsewhere in a lot of ways.
A couple of things I do. One of the things that helps me is just my students. Our students here are fabulous. They're always like, did you see this? I'm like, no, that's so interesting. And so they just send me interesting stories, current students, former students, all the time. So I rely a lot on the energy and plugged-inness of the amazing people here. And then the other thing that I do a lot of these days is I try to talk to people who work in more technology-related fields, people in computer science and computer engineering, for example, and I work with them on projects, and I try to learn what their communities are talking about and what the issues are, because they look very different sometimes from what's happening in my spaces.
I think also just as I guess the millennial at the table, maybe also there is like a responsibility to talk to our parents about these issues, right? Like, you know, and to do some intergenerational knowledge sharing and to build that literacy. You know, like these are not just like emerging and trendy and sexy things. Like, I'd like to think that my mom has privacy rights too. Like, you know.
I have 3 teenagers, so I get a lot of intergenerational advice from them about all of these issues. So that's terrific. I think I'm going to take this moment to wrap up, and I wanted to thank all of my co-panelists here, Lisa, Lex, and Felix, for a fantastic evening and great insights into some of these issues that are, as I said, complex but very, very important. And thanks very much to the audience as well. We got a lot of terrific questions. I wish we could get to all of them, but I hope we got to some of them, and I appreciate all of the input. One small plug for the company. Human Rights Watch has a film festival coming up in April. We have some amazing films. You should come to see them. Go to TIFF's website and you can check out some information about that. Friend us on our HRW Canada Facebook page and you can follow everything we do. So thank you all very much, and thank you to these terrific